I want to talk about creationist view of change in species. Before I do, I want to say something about evolutionists. Sometimes creationists think you have to be an evil person to be an evolutionist, or evolutionists are crazy, but I don't think that's true. Some of the most brilliant intellectuals on the planet are evolutionists. It's not because they're stupid at all. Furthermore, I think all of us, as we try to understand the world around us, we do the best we can with the understanding that we have and with the presuppositions that we come to. And so I think many evolutionists have run into creationists who are so uninformed that it's an embarrassment to talk to them. And yet those same uninformed creationists seem to despise the evolutionist. And so it's kind of hard to reach someone under those circumstances. So one thing we want to avoid is to make fun of those who have a different view. We may want to appeal to them to say, look, here is some evidence that's accessible to you and to me, and it really makes sense in a creationist viewpoint, but it just doesn't work for evolution. And a person whose mind is open can contemplate that evidence and think it over. It may take quite a while because it's a complicated subject. It involves biology, geology, theology, paleontology, philosophy, and perhaps other things. And so it's not a simple thing. But what I want to talk about tonight is a creationist view of change in species. And here's an outline of what I want to talk about. First, I'm going to look at the biblical text that seems to deal anyway with change in species. The question, are species fixed? That means they don't change. Or do they change? And what does the Bible have to say about that? And then I'll look at some scientific aspects about change in species. What do we see when we look in nature? What kind of evidence do we see about change in species? And then, taking some from the Bible and some from our observations of nature, maybe we can kind of put them together into kind of a creationist understanding. I'll call it a creationist theory. Now, I've used the term creation theory before, and I know that it's going to make some people nervous because theory means it's not proven, and surely creation is proven. Well, we've already talked about things not being proved. But I would like to use the word creation theory anyway, because I would make another term, and I would call it creation doctrine. So by creation doctrine, I would say, what does the Bible teach us about creation? 6 days, human separate, perfect to begin with, Sabbath, so on. That's doctrine from the Bible. But creation theory is things like this. How much do species change? The Bible doesn't tell us how much species change. That's something we try to understand from extra-biblical sources. So we'll call that our creation theory, and we'll call what the Bible teaches clearly to be the creation doctrine. So that's what I mean by creation theory, just in case you were getting a little bit nervous there in your seats. Then we'll talk about problems in the theory as we have time, and then some conclusions. Okay, what does the Bible say about diversity and change in species that's pertinent to this particular discussion? Well, there's 4 points that I've chosen. I think this covers them at least adequately for our purposes. First of all, original diversity. That is, when God created, He didn't create one bacterium and then from that create everything else. No, He created multiple kinds of things on different days of creation. And if you read the text, you'll see that the wording is plural. He made plural. According to their kinds, plural kinds. So there's different kinds from the beginning. The word in biology for organisms that have separate ancestries is polyphyly. You'll see that on the screen. Polyphyly. If those that came from a common ancestor, the word is monophyly. One ancestor, one family, if you wish, or many families. So that's the term, and that's part of the biblical teaching, in my understanding, that from the beginning there was diversity. Diversity is not something that came up. I mean, it may have increased, but it started out diverse from the beginning. Then the second point is that humans are a special creation and are endowed with the image of God. That's a clear biblical teaching, the image of God in a special creation. Third point is that there has been degeneration because of sin, and whether we know about the curses. The mechanism for the curses is debated by theologians. I know I have a good friend, theologian from Andrews Seminary, who calls it the creative curses. The idea that when God cursed it, he changed creation right at that moment with his voice, by this command. Others, and I think I personally am a little bit more inclined to think, although I'm not sure of it, to think probably what God said is, because you've done this, the result is going to be this, and it will perhaps take some time for it to fully play out. But either way, you have sin having some effect, a negative effect on nature. And then finally, adaptability. And this is a point that actually came to me relatively recently, when God said, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth." What does that imply? And in Genesis 8:17, he says to Noah, "Let the animals out of the ark so that they can go out upon the land and multiply." All right? Now, one of the results of that is that some animals are going to walk from, let's say, the mountains of Ararat area all the way to Siberia, and then during the time, there was a time when the sea level was lower. The land between Siberia and Alaska is shallow. There's evidence, in fact, there are plants that are buried, they're under the water there. That was a continuous land bridge at one time. So some of the animals walked from the mountains of Ararat through Siberia into Alaska, down in through North America, and presumably all the way down into South America, because there's animals there. That means that on their way, now I don't know that the same animal made the whole journey. They may have stopped and had families, and then the next generation moves a little farther. I don't know exactly how that happened. But in order to get there, they're going to pass through different habitats. Some wet, some dry, some hot, some cold. And in order to make that passage, they're going to have to be able to survive in those different habitats. Therefore, they're going to have a certain amount of adaptability. Variation in some form of better than others. So that's what I think is implicit in the creation story, is that God gave animals the ability to adapt to different habitats. Okay, so those are 4 points that I would bring from the Bible story. All right, let's give some illustrations of polyphyly. On day 3, God created vegetation, plants yielding seed, fruit trees bearing fruit. Okay, that's more than one kind, right? Several kinds. I don't have any idea how many kinds, but it's more than one. And so we have diversity from the beginning. So those who assume that all plants have a common ancestry are going to come to conclusions that are not going to be supported by Scripture, because they have a foundation of monophyly. So we may learn some things from them, but there's more more to nature than science can discover. Day 5, there's polyphily in the seas. Let the water be filled with many kinds of living beings. So God created the great sea monsters, all kinds of creatures that live in the water. Again, many kinds. And we can say the same thing about the air. Let the air be filled with birds. So God created all kinds of birds. And if you read the Hebrew, which I don't, you can look up the words if you want, but I think the word that's translated bird really is flying creatures. So probably bats, although biologically bats are mammals, but should I say biblically or culturally to the Israelites, they were flying creatures. So they didn't worry about the biological things that we worry about. And then on the land, let the earth bring forth living creatures, plural, according to their kinds, plural, and then some specifics, cattle, and creeping things, and beasts of the earth. So there's at least 3 different kinds right there: cattle, creeping things, beasts of the earth. And the beast is plural too, so there's more. All right, so we have polyphily. And then humans in God's image, that's well attested in Genesis 1, 26 and 27. Now, after creation, what were some of the changes that the Bible identifies? Well, the serpent would crawl on its belly. Now, if the serpent were already crawling on its belly, you could hardly say that it had already been cursed as a result of sin. Of course, Ellen White tells us that it was flying, but that, even without that knowledge, we have to say the snake, the serpent, has had some kind of change. It has gone from whatever it was before to crawling on its belly as a result of the curse. That's a kind of degeneration. In the fossil record, there are a couple of fossils that are identified as snakes that have 1 pair of legs, or even, I think, maybe some 2. So they're kind of like, well, okay, I understand. The Bible helps me understand those fossils, okay? Because they're snakes that hadn't gone completely cursed yet, apparently. Another thing that happened was thorns and thistles as a result of the curse. Thorns and thistles. This is I call this distortion. Thorns biologically are derived from tissue that looks like it should have been a leaf or a stem. Interesting, Ellen White says that Satan is the one who did this, who made the thorns and thistles. She says God never made a thorn or a thistle. But these are the works of the ingenious works of of Satan. So what that tells me is that Satan has learned how to affect the process of development. By development, I mean the growth and acquisition of characteristics from a fertilized egg to an adult. That's pretty important. The scientists are learning how to do that now, but it's a very complicated thing. Death. Death is something that came in after the fall. Now, we talked about death this afternoon. What is death? And one of the things we'll learn is that there's a difference between the technical biological terminology and the common words of Scripture. One of them is death. To us, anything that has the process of life and ceases has become dead. So we see an apple. If you eat an apple and there's cells in the apple and the cells die, then the apple has died. The biblical writers would not have recognized that concept. An apple was never alive to begin with, and even if you do consider it to be alive, what is it that you have? What is it that has died? You still have the same number of apple trees that you had before you picked the apple. Nothing really has died. You have just eaten part of it. So there's no individual that has died in that circumstance. Also, we talk about cellular death during development. Somebody was reminding us of that afterwards, after the last talk. Yes, there's that kind of death. But in the Bible, death seems to be used for creatures that have blood and breath, and terrestrial, certainly vertebrates were known to be alive. I do not know what they thought about worms. I don't know what they thought about sea creatures, whether they thought they were alive or not, but it seems that they did not think plants were alive. They didn't regard them as alive, but as either green or dry. But anyway, death, the kind of death that came in as a result of sin is the death of individuals, and especially, of course, humans and what you might call sentient beings. We may argue over whether mosquitoes died before the fall, or even whether there were any mosquitoes before the fall. But those kinds of questions are just basically speculation, kind of what makes the most sense to us. We say, okay, that's what I think, but we don't know. Another thing is violence. When the flood came, as we spoke earlier today, violence was one of the reasons for the flood, given in Genesis 6. There was no violence before the fall in the original Eden. God had provided plants for all the living creatures, or at least all the land creatures. It doesn't say what he gave for the sea creatures, but for the land creatures he gave plants. So violence came in, and that's a matter of behavior. You can have, there's an island off the British Isles somewhere, Orkneys or something like that, where the sheep and they're eating grass, encounter ground nesting birds, and they just eat them as they go along. Now, you don't usually think of sheep as being carnivorous, but these particular sheep apparently have become omnivorous, I guess, eat everything. And as is well known, bears, a great proportion of the diet of a bear is made up of berries and things like that, and a coyote the same, foxes, although they eat meat too. Corrupted flesh is another factor or effect, another effect of sin. We don't know exactly how, to give specific examples, but we can see things aren't like they should be. Diet is also a matter of behavior. So there's a lot of changes. The Bible, the idea that animals have changed since creation is certainly there in Scripture. Well, what about that phrase in Genesis that says after their kinds? Doesn't that mean that the animals will reproduce after their kinds? They can't change? When I first started working at Geo-science, if you want a little history, that was in 1984. So I've been with Geo-science for a while. I was preparing a talk on this subject, and I thought, I need to find, I know that the Bible says animals reproduce after their kind, but I don't want to just say that. I want to find the text. I want to put the text down there. So I got Genesis out and I started looking. And I looked and I couldn't find it. And I looked again and finally concluded it is not there. There is no biblical text that says that animals will reproduce after their kinds. Wow. Well, let's take a look at that. Now, the idea, let's talk about why would someone be interested in the idea that species don't change? Well, the idea of fixity of species is an idea that was popular in Darwin's day and among some Christians even today. It can be traced back to Neoplatonic philosophy, in other words, pagan Greek philosophy. It's not a biblical idea. And we just showed the biblical idea is that species are changing because of curses and sin. But this is another example of the church taking an idea that everyone knew was true and incorporating it into the teachings of the church, and there was no controversy because everyone knew it was true. But when they discovered it was false and not true, it caused a conflict between the church and science. And so when Darwin proposed his theory, it caused quite a stir. In fact, Darwin himself had read William Paley's book, Natural Theology. Paley, among other examples, he's famous for the watch example. If you found a watch, you would infer a designer. You've heard that. Everybody knows that example. But he also gave many examples from biology. You know what an earwig is? A little insect with kind of a forked tail. It gets in your garden and eats fruit, and kind of a nuisance, but nothing real serious. They have insects, including earwigs, they have antennae, right? Antennae on the front of their head. The antenna of an earwig is made up of little, what looks like balls strung on a string, little segments. Paley said the segments of the antenna of an earwig are as carefully designed and crafted by God as if he had nothing else to be concerned about. Now, I don't want to take anything away from God's craftsmanship, but the implications of a statement like that include that the fangs of a rattlesnake with the delivery system from the modified salivary glands through the venom duct into the fang with a little opening on the front side of the fang was as carefully crafted by God as though he had nothing else to be concerned about. Now, you might be comfortable with the earwig antenna, but I don't think you'll be comfortable with a rattlesnake fang. And Darwin said, I don't think nature reflects the picture of God that the Christians are telling me about. You know, Darwin took theology class, a course in college, at least part of one. His plan was to become a country parson because he figured he wouldn't have to do much that way. He could spend his time collecting beetles. Sorry, Pastor, that doesn't reflect you at all. That was long ago and far away. And so Darwin rebelled against this idea that species are fixed because he didn't believe that God would design. One of the examples he used, there's a little wasp, a little tiny wasp called an ichneumon wasp that lays its egg on the body of a caterpillar. The egg hatches, a little larva tunnels into the body of the caterpillar and feeds on the inside of the caterpillar. And just about the time the caterpillar dies, that little larva changes to a pupa, emerges as an adult wasp, and goes off looking for another caterpillar. Now, Darwin said, I don't think that God did that. And I don't think he did either. I think I have some agreement with Darwin, some of his ideas. Much as it may seem strange to say that in a church. But this idea of the perfection of nature is one you want to be careful about. Because if you start claiming that nature is perfect and just the way God did it, and no changes since then you're going to have some real trouble explaining some of the things we see. Like malaria, for example. All right, well, what does that after their kinds mean? Well, it refers to creation. It refers to creation. God created the animals after their kind. He created the beasts of the field according to their kinds. He created plants of various kinds. He created the sea creatures and the birds according to their kinds. It doesn't say anything about reproduction. It's talking about him creating. He's creating different kinds of things. The text, that phrase is also used in the animals going into the ark. They went into the ark after their kinds, or according to their kinds. Again, it's not reproduction. It's also used in Leviticus 11, where it says they're clean and unclean animals according to their kinds. But it's not used in reproduction. So let's be informed on that particular phrase. It is not stating that animals always reproduce after their kind. Now, when we observe animals reproducing, we can see for ourselves that they reproduce after their kind. That's a common observation, but it's not a biblical rule that animals can't change. Some biblical translations actually, or paraphrases, I suppose would be a better word, actually don't translate it according to their kinds, but they translate it of various kinds. So he created the land animals of various kinds. And I think that's probably a better explanation of what is intended to be said there. All right, regarding adaptability, we talked about this already. When God sent them out, after the flood especially, he sent them out to fill the earth. In order to do that, they had to be able to adapt to different parts of the world. They couldn't fill the earth unless they could occupy different habitats. So, in summary, 4 important points from the biblical story of creation. Original diversity, humans in a special creation, degeneration from sin, and adaptability. So I'm trying to build a foundation for a creationist theory here. All right, what do we see in science here? First of all, we need to define or identify the difference in definition of species. What is a species? In the Spanish Bible, the phrase according to their kinds is translated according to their species. So to a person who's reading the Spanish Bible, he is troubled when we say species change, because in his mind he's thinking species in a biblical sense, that God created different species, and now we're saying they change. So I want to distinguish what the Bible means by species or kinds from what a biologist means by species. There's a difference. We need to know that difference. A species, first line there. A species is one or more populations that are able to interbreed. The definition, now there's other definitions of species, but this one is called the biological definition of species. It means if the individuals are able to interbreed, they belong to the same species. So species is a genetic quality. If, let's see, 2 populations of a species that become isolated and lose the ability to interbreed are now considered to be 2 separate species. Not 1 anymore, but 2. What makes the difference? The ability or inability to interbreed. That's all that it matters. It doesn't matter if they look similar or look different. It doesn't matter if they're big or small. It matters if they can interbreed or not. That is the criteria for defining species in, not the only one, but that is probably I would say the major one, except that obviously doesn't work with fossils, but in terms of living creatures, yes. Natural selection. Natural selection, we'll talk a little bit more about it later, but natural selection is a process that slows down the process of degeneration because it selects out the most degenerate ones, the weak ones. They're gone. A scientist once raised a group of moths, and he reported on it. I think his name was Ford. Anyway, he reported on this experiment with moths. He raised them in an enclosure where he protected them from all natural selection. All individuals could survive. And he talked about how so many of them came out deformed, crippled. In nature, you never would have known it. But because he put them in a protected environment, they all were able to survive. Well, if that were to go on in nature, it wouldn't take too long before the species would degenerate pretty fast. So natural selection prunes away those weaker individuals and leaves only the stronger ones. It does not, however, produce new kinds of organisms or new organs. And even evolutionary biologists have come to realize this. In the past few years, evolutionary biologists, many of them, not all of them by any means, but many of them, have concluded that Darwin's theory of natural selection only works for small changes within populations or that kind of thing. It is not creating new species. We're looking for another process. Don't have one, but they're looking. They're looking in evolution, what they call evolutionary development. So, a biological species is a group of populations that can interbreed. It appears that many of the originally created kinds or species have diversified into what I would call a lineage, to lineages of different species. We could also use the term family there, into families of related species. Now, how might this happen? First, populations that are, well, first of all, we need to know that in a population, genetic change is this churning of genetics all the time. It's going on all the time. So if you have two populations that are connected and interbreeding, the genetic changes are mixed. But if you isolate them, then the genetic changes going on here are different and isolated from the genetic changes going on over here. And if there's some kind of a compatibility change, like immunology, for example, if there's an antibody if one of the populations produces a protein that the other population attacks from its immune system, then you're going to have interbreeding failure. And you can have what's called reproductive isolation. And when that occurs, you have now two species instead of one because they no longer interbreed. We call that process speciation, production of new species. It doesn't produce new kinds of animals, plants. That's important to keep, it's limited. But it does produce what I like to call locally adapted species. Species for different environments. I think this is an important process in the filling of the earth. After genetic separation comes genetic divergence. Once they are separated genetically, then any change that occurs in one population or species will not be copied in the other. They'll diverge in their own direction, depending on their environment, depending on chance, depending on selection. Now, natural selection is based on the idea of variation. And I think the point I'll make here is natural selection is impossible to avoid. Natural selection is inevitable. In fact, all living organisms have natural selection. First of all, every species varies. That applies to us. Natural selection applies to us to some extent. We interfere with natural selection when we take someone to the hospital, things like that, give them medication. But, squirrels don't have hospitals to take their sick to. Competition. Individuals compete. Sometimes they compete directly and sometimes they compete indirectly. The competition isn't necessarily physical. It may be that one animal happens to land in a better habitat than another, or one animal came up with a little stronger, or maybe he was the firstborn and got more nutrients, or the lastborn and did better. I don't know, depending on how things work. And so they're all differing in their ability to compete. And so there is a kind of a struggle for survival. Now, Darwin emphasized very strongly the struggle for survival. Today, people are recognizing that's not the whole story. There is a lot of cooperation in nature, a lot of cooperation. Animals depend on each other. Species depend on each other. So we don't want to leave that out. But still, there's not enough resources for all the offspring of every kind of animal to survive. You probably heard stories like if all the flies in the world survived and none of them died, within a few years you'd have flies 10 feet deep and that kind of stuff. There just isn't enough resources for all of them. So there's differential reproduction. Some individuals reproduce better than other individuals. And I think we could, in a very crude, not really very accurate way, but we could say, think of humans, think of this surname Smith. Now, it's a little more complicated because probably a lot of people had the name Smith to begin with. But if you look in the phone book, if they find such a thing, you probably find a whole page, several pages of Smiths, and Jones, you know, and Brown, and things like that. And Gibson, not very many Gibsons, you see. And even the ones, myself, we had 2 daughters, so we won't, you know, our generation, our next generation, that name will fade out. So if that were to continue on, you know, over a long period of time, pretty soon the whole population would just be Smiths, Jones, and Brown. There wouldn't be any Gibsons left, see? Well, that's kind of differential reproduction. That's the idea. Some individuals, some clans, some families just produce more offspring than others do. Some of it's by stronger genes, some of it's by chance. Over time, genetic change may enable a species to adapt to environmental changes. As the individuals carrying the wrong kind of gene for that environment will get wiped out, and the ones that are left will be the ones adapted for that environment. You could call it survival of the strongest. It doesn't necessarily mean the survival of the one with the most muscles. It could mean survival of the one with the best, it might even be the one with the best color. Because if you're living on a black rock and you're white, you're not going to make it. There was a study published recently about a certain kind of lizard that lives on black volcanic rocks in the Mojave Desert of California. And those lizards growing on that rock are black. The ones in the surrounding area are light colored, matching the sand. And that's because of natural selection. With variation, the ones that don't match the environment are easy for the birds, or I suppose it would be a bird that would do that. I suppose a snake can smell them. But anyway, natural selection works. Can you see that if you have variation and competition and differential reproduction, you cannot avoid natural selection? That is natural selection. It's unavoidable. But it basically prunes away the weaker individuals and allows those who happen to have the better set of genes for that local environment to survive and continue the species. It doesn't produce lungs where there were no lungs before. It doesn't produce legs where there are no legs before. It only allows a species to make those minor adaptations, usually in things like the color or the length of the tail or the length of the legs. You can find lizards, for example, and mice too, that climb up into bushes usually have longer tails than those that don't, because the tail is useful in balancing. And there's lots of other examples. Here's one. If you have a population of mosquitoes and you want to kill them, you spray them with pesticide, you won't kill them all. You'll kill most of them. There'll be a few who don't get a very high dose or who have some kind of natural resistance. So, which ones will do the breeding? The ones that are resistant. The sensitive ones die off, so you're left only with the resistant ones. And after a while, the whole population is resistant. So when you treat your cattle with antibiotics, what are you doing? You are producing antibiotic-resistant germs, because they're the only ones that can survive. And that is one of the problems, I think, that we face. Okay? Now, there is a problem in Darwin's theory, is that over long periods of time, these little changes add up to big changes. That's really the basis of Darwin's macroevolutionary theory. But John Sanford, a geneticist who used to work at Cornell University, he's a well-known person, has shown mathematically that it doesn't work. And here's the reason. As I said before, the genes are churning all the time, mutations of various kinds. Most of the mutations are a little bit harmful. Not enough to really hurt the organism, but just to kind of weaken it slightly. And most of those will be such weak effect that natural selection will not distinguish between them and other genes or other alleles. So the effect of that is that they begin to accumulate. These slightly deleterious mutations accumulate in the genome. So let's say every individual has 10 of them. So I have 10 slightly harmful genes, but not enough to affect me. My children inherit at least 5 of those, and then they add 10 more of their own. Now their children inherit at least, well, they'll also from their mother get the other 5, so they'll end up with 20. And then in the next generation, there'll be 10 more, they'll have 30. And the next generation, 40. And the next generation, 50. Well, at some point, they add up to the point where it's no longer trivial. Now you've got a problem. You have actually just gradually, like the frog in the hot water, you know, just gradually decline until some point things go wrong. And according to Sanford, the rate at which this occurs is about 1% per generation. And you can figure that, as John said, there's no way humans are millions of years old as a species. They couldn't survive that long because of this genetic deterioration. So there's something we need to include in our creation theory. We can borrow from evolution theory some of Darwin's ideas about natural selection, but we also have to include this idea of genetic meltdown or accumulation of harmful mutations. And this is Sanford's reference, 2008, Genetic Entropy and the Mystery of the Genome. He said, now, I said 10. The number of mutations we actually have is at least 100. Every person has at least 100 new mutations. In order to get rid of all those mutations through natural selection, we would have to produce more than 100 children. Now, last I've checked, that doesn't happen very often. And so that means we're not able to rid ourselves as a species. We're not able to rid ourselves of these mutations. They are inevitably accumulating. All right, so summary. New species are produced when populations lose the ability to interbreed. Now, I like that because you can see that speciation involves loss. It's not a gain. To produce a new species is not a gain. It's a loss. It's a loss of the ability to interbreed. Genetic changes cause variation among individuals, resulting in natural selection, eliminating the individuals with inferior genes. Slightly harmful mutations probably accumulate and limit the amount of change a lineage can tolerate and the length of time a species can survive. So there's, this idea of Darwin, he had some truth, but he extrapolated far beyond the evidence. All right, so what would a creationist theory look like? Well, we've probably already gone over that, but just to kind of review. First of all, there are many different kinds of creatures, of organisms at creation. We call that polyphyly. Each separately created kind, and the word Brahman is sometimes used. If you read creationist literature, you may come across that term Brahman. It comes from the Hebrew, bara min. Bara means to create, and min means kinds. So it's created kinds. Had the potential to diversify morphologically, adapt to environmental changes, and could potentially produce a lineage that includes new varieties and species by speciation. And so we will illustrate that with a figure. You've all seen figures of what's called the evolutionary tree, haven't you? One tree, one trunk with many branches coming out of it. Well, I want to replace that with a creationist forest. Lots of little trees with little branches representing local adaptations to different environments coming from a separately created ancestor. Is that You understand that? I think you can see that. There's no single tree, but I don't think fixity of species is the answer either. There you'd have a lawn with it's just, all the grass separately. And I think probably what we have for a creationist model would be a forest. Some like to use the word creationist orchard. And I like that idea at the beginning. That, in fact, an orchard is an orderly, planned arrangement of trees, isn't it? What we see today doesn't look so much like an orchard. It's degenerated and gotten kind of chaotic. So I'll use the term forest probably. All right, now if you're going to be a creationist, you want to say, okay, there are some lineages that are created separately and some species that are coming from the common ancestor. Is there any way you could estimate which ones are coming from the same and which ones are coming from different? Well, here's some ideas. Separately created lineages. If you have unique anatomical structures, for example, I was just looking at a paper about jellyfish. Jellyfish have little stinging cells called nematocysts. You've heard of people getting stung by jellyfish, I'm sure. Snails don't have those. Mollusks. People don't have them. Fish don't have them. Only jellyfish and sea anemones and maybe one or two other corals, things like that. They're the only ones that have those. That means that they do not share a common ancestor with other kinds of organisms. Now you can ask, do you think jellyfish and sea anemone have a common ancestor? Well, we're only using this one criterion right now. We're not able to test that idea with this one criterion. The fact that they have something unique means that they are not sharing a common ancestry with something else. I don't think that they all have a common ancestor, but I would use other information to make that decision, not the matter of the anatomical structure. Distinct body plans kind of goes along with that. The jellyfish and other groups, other anemones and corals have a similar kind of body structure, similar number of layers of cells and tentacles and nematocysts and so on. Mollusks have a different body plan. In fact, they're different. In my view, there are different body plans among the mollusks, but clams, for example, have quite a different body plan from a jellyfish. You'd never confuse the two. And likewise, fish, they're quite different from both of them. So if they have distinct body plans, they are surely not from a common ancestor. They're separately created. Different developmental trajectories. Now this is a little more technical. It takes more research and we don't, as far as I know, at least I don't know very much information about that particular thing. But if the way an organism develops from an embryo up to an adult is quite different from the way another one does, I would suspect that they were created with in different creations. Here's an example of a unique structure in the group called echinoderms. This is a starfish, and it has these arms with a little water vascular system. In other words, the water transport things around and it has little canals and branches to it, tube feet and all that. Here's another coelenterate. This has the nematocysts, and it has the, like the jellyfish, but it's interesting. I just read this article on jellyfish genes, and they were comparing the jellyfish genes with the sea anemone genes, and they're very different genes. Based on that, I would suggest they have different ancestries. They're created separately. Here's developmental pathways. You've probably all seen Haeckel's vertebrate embryo drawings, in which he shows how similar the pig is to the chicken and the fish and the human. Well, it turns out that Haeckel didn't draw those things very accurately. In fact, it seems that he used the same embryo more than once for different animals. And others, he kind of doctored them up a little bit, and he chose the stage of the life cycle in which they're the most similar. But someone else has looked at this data, and you can see how different the developmental sequence is on those different kinds of animals. They're really quite different. And yet Haeckel's drawings, I remember my textbook had those in. Did yours? Have you seen those? Yeah. We were taught that was the way it was. It isn't the way it is. It's made up. It's kind of an embarrassment to the evolutionary community because evolutionists do not intend to be deceptive. They want the facts. And they were kind of embarrassed when they learned. The funny thing is, when Haeckel drew them back about 1895 or somewhere back there, his contemporaries accused him of that very thing. But it was such a beautiful story for evolutionists that it was too good to let go. Do we have temptations that way? Do we sometimes tell stories that we know aren't quite right, but they make the point so well? Yeah, got to watch out for that. It can come back to bite us. All right, what about, could we estimate what organisms have a common ancestor, not separate ancestors, but actually have evolved, if you want to say that, have descended from a created ancestor? Well, if they can crossbreed, that's pretty suggestive. I wouldn't say necessarily proof, but it's something to look for anyway. If they can crossbreed and produce offspring, that's a suggestion that they might have a common ancestor. I'll show you some examples in a minute. And then there are biogeographic arguments too. We'll give some examples here. Here are some examples of hybridization. You ever seen a zorse? Or a liger? Or a lepjag? Or a zedonk? These are hybrids, lepjag. Usually the male name comes first. So I think a lepjag would be a male leopard and a female jaguar. I saw one once in Florida at a breeding facility for large cats. In fact, that's probably where the picture came from. Zedonk would be, the father would be a zebra and the mother a donkey. Well, we're all familiar with a mule. I guess what would you call that? A donk horse or something? I don't know. But anyway, there are really only two lineages here that I remember. One was the horse, zebra, donkey group. And based on hybridization, you might suspect that all the horse family comes from an ancestral horse that God created. It kind of looks that way. Not proved, but that's the implication here. The lion and the tiger and the leopard and the jaguar probably also have come from a common ancestor because you get hybrids of some of them at least. Another suggested criteria to look for common ancestry is if you have one particular area and there's a whole bunch of varieties, maybe similar species that are just restricted to that one area, like Lake Victoria on the border between Kenya and Uganda, has over 500 species of fish that belong to the same family, Cichlidae. If you've ever had an aquarium, you have an Oscar or an angelfish, those are cichlids. That's in that family, Cichlidae. In Lake Victoria, there are hundreds of species that are found nowhere else, only in that one lake. Well, it's easy to suppose that some ancestral cichlid fish was in that lake, and it is a very large lake. It is so large, I don't know if you can even see across it. It's very, very large. And it's lots of habitats. Rocky bottom, muddy bottom, shallow water, deep water, all plant among the cattails or out in the open, up in the water column, down at the bottom, lots of different habitats. And so you have this ancestral species that could just swarm all over, and those that stayed in one habitat gradually were selected for that habitat and became different from the others. Now you can ask, are these really different species? Are they unable to interbreed? And in many cases you would find that yes, they can hybridize. I don't know that they all can, but many of them can. So another example that we could use is if we have those similar species that spread out all over the earth. and just look like locally adapted varieties. Here's an example of that. The dog family. It's all one family. You have coyotes here. You have jackals in Africa that look very similar to our coyotes. You also have jackals in India. You have also some strange-looking dogs, the raccoon dog of Japan and Eastern Asia. You have the dhole dog of India. You have the Cape hunting dog or painted dog in South Africa. You have the maned wolf with very long legs in South America. You have dogs all over the world, but they're all in the same family. Someone recently pointed to I hadn't realized this particular reference. Somebody studied variations in the skull primarily of domestic dogs. And they found, which we know to be one species, right? Domestic dogs are all one species. They can all interbreed. You know, a St. Bernard and a Chihuahua might not interbreed, but the St. Bernard can interbreed with a collie, and the collie with a terrier, and a terrier with a Chihuahua. So genes can flow through all these breeds. They found that amongst domestic dogs there was greater variability than in the whole dog family combined, which tells me that the dog has the capacity to vary enough to fill the earth with all these varieties of dogs. So that's an argument that dogs have a common ancestor. Whether I haven't proved it's true, but it's a hypothesis that looks like it explains it. Now, here's a question for you. This brings up the problem of time. You all know what a hummingbird is. Do you have any idea how many species of hummingbirds there are? About 300. About 300. How are you going to get 300 species since Noah let them out of the ark? Wow, that might take millions of years. If you look at the fossil record, you ask, how long does a mammal species, according to the geological time scale, which I reject, but looking at this from what scientists claim, how long does it take for one species of mammal to replace another? And the typical answer is about 1 million years. So scientists conclude that it takes 1 million years for one species to change into another species by Darwinian processes. That's not going to fit very well with our hummingbirds, is it, with 300 species? Well, what do we actually see? Those are the theories of scientists. What do we actually see? You know what an African green monkey is, or vervet? Somebody moved some green monkeys from Africa to the island of St. Kitts in the Caribbean about 300 years ago. And by comparing them now, we can see that they are as different from each other as different species of monkeys are. So the amount of change that would be enough to produce a different species occurred in 300 years, not millions. Well, how about the Laysan finch? You see that one there, Laysan finch. There was a group of birds that was only found on one island out in the Pacific called the Laysan finch. It was on Laysan Island, oddly enough. And in order to kind of prevent the species from going extinct when some hurricane came by and wiped out the island, they transferred some of the birds to another island called Southeast Island to get so they had two populations. It's much more likely that one would survive. Within 10 or 12 years, there was a difference between the two populations. They could be called different species, except that we don't believe that. But in terms of the beak shape and so on, it took 10 or 12 years. So how long does it take to produce a new species? Not necessarily very long. Let's just be generous and say 1,000 years. Okay? 1,000 years. That's surely plenty of time given the right circumstances. All right? Lake Victoria is home to more than 500 species of cichlid fish found nowhere else. I mentioned that earlier. According to the long chronology, which again, I don't accept it, but we'll look at it for the argument's sake, That lake is supposed to have dried out about 12 to 15,000 years ago. What that means is that those 500 species were produced, according to evolutionists, were produced in 15,000 years. Let's see, 15,000 divided by 500, what's that, 30? 30 years of species? Something like that? Well, that's believable, but still 15,000 years is beyond our budget here. All right, so those are two examples of rapid change, and there are others too. So let's say we want to have a common ancestor, an ancestral hummingbird, and we want to produce 300 species. All right, here's a diagram. It doesn't have 300, but you get the point. One of them, starting with the ancestor, you get one branched out, and then another, 1,000 years apart. How long would it take? 300,000 years. That's not rocket science. 300,000 years, you could produce all 300 species of hummingbirds. Okay. Well, what if they just divided and split into two, and then into two, and then into two, each one into two? How long would that take? Well, how many divisions, how many doublings would you have to have in order to reach 300? Well, you can calculate that by powers of 2. I think probably 9. Is that what it says? Yeah. So you'd need 9 speciation periods, 9,000 years. Hey, not bad. You know, that's not so far off from 5,000 in terms of order of magnitude, you know. So there's ways to get species faster than just one at a time. On the other hand, suppose this hummingbird came out from the ark, went into South America, and found that there were lots of different kinds of flowers available for food, lots of different habitats available, and so it spread out all over the continent, and then in each locality it began to adapt. So you get this kind of a diagram. How long would it take? 1,000 years. You could get all 300 species in 1,000 years under this model. So the point that I want to make is not that this is what happened. The point I want to make is that you can produce a lot of species in a short time if they're invading an unoccupied habitat. And what better scenario than right after the worldwide flood? So in a creationist explanation, it makes sense. Yeah, that could happen that way. Did it happen that way? I suppose it happened something like that. I don't know just how it happened, but it doesn't worry me anymore to worry about how you could have 300 species of hummingbirds since the flood. So a short chronology may very well produce plenty of time. I think it doesn't happen that way now because the habitats are already occupied. And when you put a new invader in an occupied habitat, there's competition going on. It doesn't work so well. The one who's already there is probably already adapted for that habitat, and the newcomer isn't. So he's not going to succeed very well unless it's a house sparrow. But if it's unoccupied, you can get large numbers of species, I think, in a short time. All right. So here we have our creationist forest. This is going to be the last slide. I want to leave this picture with you to summarize what I think is a creationist view of speciation. It is many separately created ancestors that have, especially since the flood, have spread out across the world in a short period of time, encountered open habitats, adapted to them, and speciated rapidly, whether it's dogs or hummingbirds or whatever it might be. So that's my presentation, and we'll take questions now.